Hello and welcome to this lecture on Adobe Photoshop by Edgeonix. In this lecture we're going into modifying selections, which includes the Refine Edge dialog. So there are some basic ways to modify it, and there's some advanced ones. There's some ways that can be combined. First off, I'm just going to show you all the basic quick ways to modify a selection. Of course, you know, with the selection tool, here you have a selection. Modifying it could be as little as holding in Shift and adding to the selection, or holding in Alt and subtracting. Or holding in Alt and Shift and intersecting a selection. That's the simplest kind of modifications to a selection I think there are, and they're very useful, and you can do that with any selection tool. There's some other ways, like transforming the selection, refining the edge. You can do a color range where it selects colors and you get to select how close to the colors the selection will be. You can add to or take away from them too. And if I did a color range right now, it would be in regards to the square I've already selected. You can save and load selections. Let's go into transforming a selection. Now this is just like making a transformation, except in this case, instead of transforming the pixels, you'll be transforming the actual selection. So a selection is currently a square. If I hold in Control or Command on a Mac, I can manipulate these individual points, and they work kind of like a mesh, like an anchor points. They work kind of like the normal transform. If I hold in Alt, for example, I can get these kind of effects. Symmetry, opposite corners. And if I press Shift, and I'm doing the same motion I was doing with just Alt, so now I have Alt and Shift. And I've been holding in Control the whole time. So there's a lot of dynamics here that you should learn on your own. Like this is just Alt, for example. There's just a whole lot of stuff you can do. So depending on what your mouse cursor is, like right here, you can tell it's going to be the scale group. And now here it's the rotate. If you go a little farther out from the anchor, you'll get the rotate icon. That has a whole different group of things that happen when you hold in Alt, Shift, and Command. So one thing they're good for is cropping, selections in general, I mean. The only way to get parallel selection is to use the transform selection. It's the only way to transform a selection without transforming the image behind it. So you can actually enter in the coordinates up here too. If I hit 0, for example, it'll reset it to the original angle I had it at. And I can always undo that to get the original angle also, or use my history panel. You can also hit escape, but you have your history there, so anyway, go back to transform selection and just experiment with the different combinations of Control and Alt. That's Command and Option on a Mac. This is with Control pressed in. This is with Shift pressed in. And after you've done one thing with like control, it locks it in place. So now that's what I'm doing. I have to hit control again to move it. I can hit alt at any time and make it symmetrical. So there's a lot of different combinations. I'll say it again and again, just make sure you practice with them. These keys will alter everything, not just selections and transformations. It's a lot more than just that. So that's one of the main ways of transforming your selections. Aside from subtracting, adding, and I'm going to make 2 new layers right now. In previous tutorials, but I'm just going to make some quick, dark, contrasted shapes. I'm going to hide that layer just to show you how it works. Using my quick selection tool, I'm going to select the general shape of this flower. I'm just holding and dragging and kind of, you have to make sure your brush size up in the options panel is small enough. And the quick selection tool is really great. Anyway, I'm going to control click this layer icon. Hold down shift, control shift click, or command shift click on a Mac. On any of these icons like the ones in the layers panel, and it'll select that and add it to it. You can just regularly select things that are on that layer too by just control clicking them. It'll make the selection. And then you can switch layers after that. But let's go over some of these basic commands. The first is inverse, which is if you want to get rid of a background, you'll invert the selection and hit delete, or you can put a mask over it. Also, control shift I does the same thing, it's just a shortcut. Now under select, let's take a look at modify. Now 2 of these are really useful, and that's expand and contract, as well as border. As far as smooth and feather, I wouldn't really worry about those because as you can see, it doesn't give you any preview option. You're kind of flying blind. And both smooth and feather are located in refine edge. So back to the dialog modify. Expand and contract are good when you don't want to use refine edge, even though they are also in refine edge. So if I were to hit 2 pixels, it'll make my selection 2 pixels bigger essentially. So what I like to do is, if you can see that there's still a little black left in there, you can hit delete multiple times and it'll continuously, it'll start to create a harder edge. If you're familiar with this technique, it's deleting all the fringe pixels because it's taking, like, say a 50% pixel and it's doing 50% of that and 50% of that. But so to smooth it out a little bit, you can feather it to make the average weight of the line smoother, or you can just use the smooth tool in refine edge dialog. And at this point, you can literally just go in with your eraser, making sure your layer is selected, and just manually brush out the black. When I show you refine edge in its entirety, I'll be showing you a lot more tools. Fortunately for this image, this is about all we need to do. So that's expand. It's useful for getting rid of fringe pixels. So that's the hard edge I was talking about earlier. Going back to modify, contract will do the opposite of expand. So hit 14 pixels and you can see from every pixel it's gone 14 pixels in. The modify border is actually pretty cool. This is a whole bunch of things at once. So as you can see, it goes out 2 in each direction. I selected 2 or 4. What this is great for is creating actual art outlines. If I were to bring up the paint tool, Shift G, with a new layer, just using the selection of the actual flower. And keep in mind you can save these too. Now I have a little outline of the flower. Same with the silhouette, it's essentially the same idea. The last tool I'm going to show you is save selection and load selection. It's pretty self-explanatory, but before I do that, let's take a look at quick mask mode, which is shortcut key Q, and what it does and what I use it for. It basically changes your brush into a selection tool. Now everything that's red is what is not selected, and everything that's white is, it's basically a mask, and your mask is like a red material. So if you're on Photoshop CS6 or earlier, it'll say quick mask, and if you're on CC, it'll say alpha, and you can tell what state you're in by just looking up at the file up there in the file row. And now I can see there's some holes right here. I would normally fill them in. So with quick selection on, you can see that there's some spaces I can take care of. It makes things kind of clear. I can just go in there with a brush something to note, it's hard to tell, but if you had this quick mask going over any of the actual image, it would just make the image all red and kind of dark. You could still see what it is, but basically you know when it's covering something. It's hard to tell with this one because it was just white. So there's 2 options that we haven't gone into. With your shape selected, go to save selection, give it a name, just anything will do. And what that's doing is it's saving it as a channel. If we look in our channels, so we can do the whole control clicking the thumbnail to bring up our selection to load it. You can also go to load selection. And the load selection has additional options that you get with basically holding in Control or Alt and clicking on the thumbnail and the channels. But if you prefer using this way, so here's an example of me doing it. If I want to add to, or just hold in Shift and Control, and then loading the selection by clicking on the selection in the channels. So, and that's going to add it to that rectangle that I had before it, or any other selection you would have before it. If I hold in Control and Alt or Command and Option on a Mac, I can subtract from the selection, as you can see. So you don't have to use the load selection basically if you don't want to. It's a little quicker just to do it this way. But you might prefer just starting out with selections to use the load selection. So I'm just going to transform the selection, and just to close out the video, I encourage you to play around with transform selection, to play around with transformations, and especially to play around with refine edge, which is a different tutorial, but it's something it's never too early to learn. So if you click here, you get a little thing called warp mode, and that's when you have a transform selection made. I'm not going to go too much into this because it's very similar to an Illustrator tool, but you can basically move these handles and paths and things around to basically create a warp mesh on top of your existing image. You can even do this with a transforming selection. At this point it's kind of strange, but definitely play around with the warp transformation as I'm doing right here. If you're familiar with Illustrator, there's something just like it in there called the envelope distort, make with warp, or make with mesh option. But play around with it in the transform and play around with it in transform selection. It's all the same, but that does it for this section on modifying selections. Next one will be refine edge. But just practice everything you saw here, and thanks for watching.